what if everything we think we know about fixing ourselves, about therapy, what if it's looking in the wrong place? What if the true source of healing, of our potential, isn't something we have to build up, but something ancient, profound, and actually already exists inside us, just waiting to be unveiled?
That's a fascinating question, and it really gets right to the heart of what we're exploring today.
Yeah.
We're taking a deep dive into a pretty unique vision of the human being. It's an Indonesian concept called Candrajiwa Indonesia.
Okay.
And our guide for this, it's this remarkable source, a 1956 dissertation from Leiden University. The title is Candrajiwa Indonesia as a Basis for Psychotherapy.
Wow, 1956.
Yeah.
And what makes this source so interesting, you mentioned, is the author himself, Sumantri Harjoprakoso. He wasn't just an academic, right?
Exactly. He was a psychiatrist.
Yeah.
So he's doing something pretty incredible here, trying to bridge, deep Indonesian spiritual and philosophical ideas with Western medicine, with psychiatry.
That's a huge undertaking, a real cross-cultural synthesis focused on healing.
It really is. And he credits some key people who influenced him, like R. Trihardono Samodir Harjo, who he says showed him the way to dare to keep fighting for what I considered the purpose of life.
Powerful stuff.
Yeah. And he also acknowledges Professors R. Slamet Iman Santoso and E.D.E. Karp. There's this really vivid analogy he uses for Professor Karp.
Oh, yeah.
He calls Karp the midwife to the dissertation, while he, the author, was the mother.
Huh. That really paints a picture, doesn't it? The kind of support needed for something this complex.
It does. It suggests a real intellectual partnership.
Okay, so our mission for this deep dive, then, is to really try and understand this specific Indonesian view of what it means to be human, its structure, its potential, and particularly how it offers maybe a completely different lens for healing, for self-understanding.
That's the plan. And we're going to build this understanding only from the details, the insights found in this one foundational text.
Got it. So sticking closely to the source, where do we start? What's the core idea?
Well, at its core, the text explains that, look, every culture has its concept of man, its Candramanusia, a sort of guide for life.
Okay, a guiding image.
Right. But what makes this specific Indonesian concept stand out, according to the dissertation, is its explicit aim. It's all about self-development, directed towards merging with a transcendent absolute.
Merging with the absolute. So it's fundamentally pointed inward.
Exactly. Towards something universal within you. It's not about, say, pleasing external powers or gods, that sort of thing.
And the source gives a specific origin for this concept.
It does. It traces it back to 1932 to a man named R. Sunarto Mertowardojo. He apparently heard an inner voice.
An inner voice, like literally hearing something.
The text says it wasn't perceived physically, like with the ears. It was more like a profound shift in consciousness, something that answered his deepest questions about truth, true knowledge. It revealed a path and spoke of this living life right there in the heart, acting as an advisor, a guide.
So it comes from direct inner experience, not like a set of rules handed down.
Precisely, and that's key. The dissertation really highlights the significance of this origin. It claims this concept offers a complete picture of man and the world, all from this single internal source.
A complete picture.
Yes, and it's also seen as having the most in common with various other Indonesian ideas about humanity. And crucially, for the author's purpose as a psychiatrist, it serves as a direct source from which psychotherapy can actually be derived.
Okay, so it's not just philosophy. It's seen as practically applicable to healing.
That's the argument.
And a foundational idea here you mentioned earlier is man as a microcosmos.
Yes. The microcosm. Humans are believed to contain all the elements of the universe, the macrocosmos, but structured within us in different internal centers.
Right, like a map of the inner world.
That's a good way to put it. It's our starting point for understanding the structure of the human being in this view. The text describes these layers, sort of hierarchical, moving from the outside, the coarse material world.
Like the physical body and the world we touch.
Yeah. Then inward, through the fine material world, and finally to the immaterial world. And these layers correspond to different forms of life, biological, psychic, and spiritual.
Okay, layers. And within these layers are the vital centers.
Exactly, the vital centers. And the source presents one as the absolute essential core, the immaterial center. It's called Tripurusa.
Tripurusa, what is that exactly?
It's described as the original source of all life itself. It's primordial, eternal, fundamentally one.
The source of everything.
Yes. And it manifests, according to the text, in three aspects. There's suksma koekas, that's the quiet, static life. Then suksma sajati, the dynamic life, the one that acts as the guide, the light, the path, the teacher.
The inner voice, perhaps.
Connected to that idea, yes. And the third aspect is Rosutsi, the human spirit, which is understood as a spark originating from suksma koekas.
The spark of the divine, almost.
You could say that. This whole center, Tripurusa, is presented as absolute, totally free of desire.
And it's the gate to a transcendent state, you said.
Correct. But here's the thing. It's not always directly experienced. The source uses this really striking analogy.
Yeah?
It says the ego consciousness covers it up, like a veil. Or like a fog covering something bright.
Ah, the ego gets in the way. So that fog, that veil, what creates it?
That's where the next layer of vital centers comes in. These are the material or matter-bound centers. Angen-angen, nafsu, and rasa. These are the parts of ourselves we usually identify with, our thoughts, feelings, drives.
Okay, let's break those down. Angen-angen first. The text calls it intellectual capacity, or logos.
Yes. And it's described in a fascinating way. It's seen as a reflection of Tripurusa, but within the material body.
A reflection?
Yeah, the analogy used is moonlight being a reflection of sunlight. Angen-angen isn't the original light, but it reflects it.
Interesting. And it has facets.
3 of them. Sipta, which is our capacity for thought, for forming images in the mind. Neller, that's associative thinking, reasoning, logic. And Pangerti, or Kamayan, that's understanding, the power of the mind.
So thinking, reasoning, understanding.
Right. And its defining characteristic is said to be sovereignty, but it's reflected sovereignty, remember, not the ultimate source.
So our sense of I, our ego consciousness, that's basically formed by this angen-angen.
Fundamentally, yes. And this ego, formed by the intellect, is what creates that veil we talked about. It covers over our feelings, which is panglasa, and our drives, which is nafsu.
So the thinking mind obscures the deeper layers.
That's the idea. Angen-angen, the intellect, can also become like a container for stuff we repress, images we hold on to.
Like baggage.
Sort of. And the source suggests that releasing a full or overloaded angen-angen, well, that can happen through acceptance, which is called Narima, and surrender, pasra. Concepts we'll definitely come back to.
Acceptance and surrender, okay. And dreams.
Dreams, in this view, are simply overflows from a full angen-angen, like the container spilling over.
Makes sense. Okay, what about nafsu? These sound powerful. Drives, vitality forces.
They really are. Nafsu are described as innate forces within the body. They're polarized, meaning they have positive and negative potentials, and they operate largely unconsciously.
Unconscious drives. Okay, how many are there?
The text details 4 main ones. First, mutmena. This one's associated with the air element. It's a social and even super social drive. Think love for others, community feeling.
Okay, mutmena, social connection.
Then there's amara, linked to fire.
Oh, wait.
This is determination, willpower, but also temper, anger.
Fire, yeah. Determination and temper.
Third is sufia, connected to water. This is desire, longing, the love for beauty, aesthetics.
Water, desire, beauty.
And finally, luama, tied to the earth element. This is the most egoistic drive. It's about survival, the sexual drive, self-preservation, even self-worshipping.
Earth, ego, survival. So mutmena, amara, sufia, and luama. 4 primary drives.
Correct. And the text views these 4, along with angen, intellect, and the next one, rasa pangrasa, feelings, as like 7 sibling forces.
7?
Yeah, forces that can either be in conflict, pulling in different directions, or they can learn to work together, strive towards a common goal.
Interesting. Okay, so the third matter-bound center is rasa pangrasa. Emotional life, feelings.
That's right. This center is what creates and maintains our internal psychic climate. Whether it feels generally positive or negative, it's described as broad, absorbing, nurturing. It emphasizes subjectivity, coherence in our feeling life.
So it's where we feel things.
Exactly. But, like the other centers, it can also become restless, disturbed, out of balance.
Okay, so we have this inner map now. This deep, hidden core, Tripurusa, veiled by the ego, which is angen-angen, influenced by these powerful drives, nafsu, and colored by our emotional climate, rasa pangrasa.
That's the basic structure described.
And the source says these centers can be out of whack, in disharmony, or they can strive for integration.
Yes, absolutely. And the text makes a crucial point. Where you place your center of gravity internally determines which functions dominate your life.
Center of gravity, meaning what you identify with most.
Kind of. If your center of gravity is mainly in nafsu, the drives, then biological or lustful aspects will rule your life.
Yeah.
If it's more in the psychic realm, angen-angen or pangrasa, then Intellect or emotions will be dominant. Your inner orientation shapes your whole experience.
Right. Which leads us, I guess, to the core purpose outlined in this dissertation, the path to the ideal man, or liberation. Pamudaran, they call it.
Pamudaran, yes. Liberation.
So if the problem is this ego veil covering the true core, what's the ultimate goal then?
The goal is nothing less than the immaterial existence itself. It's about union with Tripurusa.
Union with the source.
Exactly. The ideal man, reaching what's called the Rosusi state, is presented as a final stage you can actually attain in this life. It's not just for after death.
Attainable in life. Wow. And what's that state like?
It's described as a state where positive qualities just emanate spontaneously from within. And liberation, Pamudaran, ultimately means the individual ego consciousness, that veil, dissolves. It gets absorbed into the collectively conscious, the universal Tripurusa.
That's pretty radical. It's a complete shift from just, managing your ego better or fitting into society.
It's a fundamental transformation, yes. And the source is clear. This path is difficult.
I bet. What does it actually involve? How do you thin that veil?
It requires a conscious, deliberate shift in that center of gravity we talked about, moving it away from the external material aspects of these vital centers, thoughts, feelings, drives, and towards the internal immaterial core, Tripurusa.
Shifting focus inward.
Deeply inward. The veil of ego consciousness has to thin out and ultimately disappear for that union to happen.
Okay, so how does the dissertation suggest someone actually do that? It sounds like it outlines specific practices, principles, almost like a training manual for this inner journey.
That's a good way to think about it. There are several key practices. The main guide is called Trisila, the 3 moral teachings.
Trisila. Okay, what are the 3?
First is awareness of Tripurusa. Really recognizing its presence not just in yourself, but in everyone, in everything.
Awareness. Got it.
Second is belief in Tripurusa. And this isn't just like intellectual belief, oh yeah, I believe that exists. It's described more as deep faithfulness, trust.
Faithfulness.
Yeah. Deeper
than just thinking it's true.
Right. And the third is obedience or compliance to Tripurusa. This is maybe the hardest part. Surrendering your nafsu, your drives, your individual will to the guidance coming from that inner source.
Surrender. Okay, that's challenging.
Definitely. But these 3, awareness, belief, obedience, are seen as the way to mobilize all those vital centers, get them pointing toward the ultimate goal.
So Tritila is the compass. And then there's Pancasila. 5 character traits. Are these related?
They are. Pancasila are the qualities you need to cultivate to actually live Trisila. They're the embodiment of it.
Okay, what are these 5 qualities?
First is Rila. This means being willing to sacrifice, being able to detach from transient things, possessions, status, whatever, without feeling pain or suffering. Accepting loss gracefully.
Rila, detachment, acceptance of loss.
Second is Narima. This is about accepting whatever life brings your way with inner balance, not comparing yourself, not coveting what others have. But it's not passive resignation. It's finding a richness in acceptance.
Narima, active acceptance, finding inner balance.
Third is Temen. This means being honest, true to your word, keeping promises. The text says this naturally leads to justice and truth in your actions.
Temen, honesty, integrity.
Fourth is Sabar. This is patience, tolerance, persistence. Being able to bear trials without collapsing. It also includes respecting other paths, other religions.
Sabar, patience, tolerance, persistence.
And finally, the 5th is Budi-Luhur. Noble character. This isn't so much a trait you cultivate directly, but a state you reach after the other 4 are well established.
Budi-Luhur, the culmination.
Kind of. In this state, you're no longer bound by rigid rules, though you still respect them. Your main focus is just maintaining this noble state. The ego, now integrated, acts on behalf of the totality.
Wow. Rila, Narima, Temen, Sabar, Budi-Luhur. That's quite a list.
It is, and there's a great analogy the text uses to tie these together with Trisila.
Oh yeah, I like the analogies.
It compares the soul to a field. Rila, detachment, is the plow that breaks the hard ground. Temen, honesty, is the seed you plant. Sabar and Narima, patience and acceptance, are the fertilizer that helps the seed grow. Trisila, the 3 teachings, is the essential water. And then there's Paliwara.
Paliwara. What's that?
That's the pest control.
Pest control. Okay, what does Paliwara actually mean?
It refers to prohibitions, specific things to avoid doing because they strengthen the negative aspects of the nafsu drives, especially lawama, that really egocentric, self-worshipping drive.
So don't feed the ego monster, basically.
That's a good way to put it. Avoid actions that reinforce selfishness and attachment.
Okay. The text also mentions tapabrata, asceticism. Yeah. How did that fit in? Is it about punishing the body?
Not exactly punishment. The text presents tapa brata differently. It's seen as a tool, a method for training the nafsu. Again, particularly lawama.
Training the drives.
Yeah, by transforming those negative, egocentric impulses into resilience, into inner strength. It involves intentionally reducing physical needs, eating less, drinking less, sleeping less, reducing the sexual drive.
Okay, simplifying needs.
But the source is very clear. It has to be proportionate. You shouldn't harm the body. It's not about self-mortification as an end goal or some kind of ritual ceremony. It's a practical tool to keep that inner struggle, that training, alive and active.
A tool, not a goal. Got it. What else? There's Buddhi Dharma?
Buddhi Dharma, yes. This translates roughly as compassion or helpfulness.
Helping others.
Right. But it's described specifically as a method of self-purification. It helps develop the pure feelings you need for meaningful prayer and for strengthening that core faith, that belief aspect of Trisila.
So helping others purifies your own feelings.
That's the idea. It's about helping others based on love, genuine care, contributing whatever you can, material help, knowledge, physical strength. And critically, the text says it requires Narima, that acceptance, to be done sincerely without expecting something back or feeling superior.
Interesting link between compassion and acceptance. Okay, and the final practice seems really central. Penemba. Prayer or devotion.
Yes, Penemba. This is described as absolutely essential for making that shift in the center of gravity, for connecting with the immaterial center, Tripurusa.
How does prayer achieve that shift?
It requires consciously letting go of the constant stream of daily worries, desires, plans. The text calls it the world that follows you into ibadat. Ibadat meaning devotion.
Leaving the world behind mentally.
Exactly. This practice aims to create a state of inner stillness. Stillness in angen-angen and the intellect. Stillness in nafsu, the drives. Stillness in rasa pangrasa, the feelings.
Quieting the inner noise.
Yes. And in that quiet space, connection with Rahsa Jati, the true consciousness, becomes possible. The text calls this state of prayer an oasis in the desert of desire.
An oasis.
And the ultimate goal is for this oasis just a temporary refuge.
And is that stillness where things like intuition or revelation come from?
According to the text, yes. Intuition or revelation are seen as temporary manifestations of that immaterial center, Tripurusa. They are moments when your individual consciousness makes contact with Sakjeroning, Jati, the inner guide.
Meetings with the guide.
Occurring in that stillness. And they can provide knowledge or insight that goes beyond your personal experience, beyond normal limits of space and time.
So all these practices work together to reorient you inward towards Tripurusa.
That's the framework presented.
The dissertation also talks about karma and the afterlife, connecting them back to this inner journey. How does karma fit into this Indonesian concept?
Karma is understood as a law of cause and effect, pretty standard in that sense. But it's presented specifically as a reflection of your inner state and your actions based on that state.
A reflection.
Yes, and the source suggests that actively living by Trisila and Pancasila, cultivating those qualities, can actually flatten or mitigate negative karma. It smooths out the karmic consequences.
So your inner orientation affects your karma.
Absolutely. How karma manifests, whether it feels like a blessing or a punishment, depends entirely on your fundamental attitude towards Tripurusa and towards reality itself.
What about for someone really dedicated to this path, seeking liberation? How do they view karma?
For that person, the text says, there isn't really good or bad karma in the usual sense. There are just experiences. And your actions, your responses to those experiences, determine whether you stay bound by cause and effect or whether you move closer to liberation.
It becomes fuel for the journey, rather than reward or punishment.
Something like that, yes.
And what about death? You said it's not just an end.
Right. Death is seen as a really crucial transition. It's described as a special opportunity for the consciousness to shift fully and finally to Tripurusa.
An opportunity?
Yes. The gate to Rahsa Jati, the true consciousness, opens at death. Sakjeroning, the inner guide, calls you back. The text presents this moment as a unique, singular chance for complete liberation, the culmination of all the inner work done during life.
Wow. So death is potentially the ultimate graduation.
If you've prepared for it, yes.
But what does the source say happens if someone hasn't oriented themselves inward during their life, if they haven't been on this path?
Well, for those individuals, the text describes a much more challenging state after death. They're seen as becoming increasingly helpless, disoriented. The text uses the term fully autistic, meaning deeply cut off from the sensory world they were previously centered in and unable to connect with the inner reality.
isolated.
Very isolated. It suggests contact might occur with other kinds of beings, spirits or doa, but this is viewed negatively. It leads to a kind of false purification, a detour, that makes returning to the true path towards Tripurusa very, very difficult.
So the emphasis is really strongly on the work you do during life.
Overwhelmingly so. Your orientation during life determines your experience at and after death.
It's really striking how this Candramanusia Indonesia concept provides such a complete integrated picture, the structure of the self, the ultimate purpose, the path, the consequences.
It is remarkably comprehensive based on this dissertation.
And the author, being a psychiatrist, doesn't just present it in isolation. He explicitly brings it into conversation with Western psychology, right? What are some of the key comparisons or contrasts the source highlights?
Yes, this is where he really builds that bridge he intended. One absolutely core area of contrast is the whole concept of the ego.
The ego, yeah. How does it differ?
Well, in Candrajiwa, as we've discussed, the ego, formed by angen-angen, is primarily the veil. It's something that obscures the inherent divine core, Tripurusa. Tripurusa itself is the source of ultimate sovereignty and harmony waiting within.
Okay, the ego hides the true self.
Whereas compare that to, say, Jung. In Jung's model, you have the ego, and then the self, or diri in some translations, is often seen as something larger, encompassing the conscious and unconscious, maybe even above the ego in a way. The ego might be less conscious than the self.
So the hierarchy is different.
Very different. In Jung, unconscious content can create tension with the ego, needing integration. In Candrajiwa, the manifestation of the immaterial center, Tripurusa, is actually enabled by the ego having a positive, accepting attitude. It's adjusted to your personal capacity. So the whole starting point for healing looks different. Is it about uncovering something already perfect or integrating disparate parts?
Uncovering versus integrating. That's a key distinction. What about the drives? How do those four Napsu forces stack up against Western ideas like Freud's drives?
The Candrajiwa model provides a very explicit structure for the drives. You have those four distinct forces, Lamama, Amara, Sufia, Mutmena, each with its element, its characteristics, and their potential interactions.
Very specific.
Yes. Including the idea that Lawama, the egoistic drive, can actually be sublimated, transformed into resilience through practice like Tapabrata. This is maybe more detailed and differently categorized than, say, Freud's broader concepts of libido, the pleasure principle, or the death drive, which often focus more on repression and the symptoms arising from instinctual conflicts. The Indonesian system gives you a very specific internal map of these energies to work with.
And the idea of conscience, where does that come from in this model?
That's another fascinating difference. In Candrajiwa, conscience isn't just internalized rules. It's seen as being influenced by two things: the extra-empirical Tripurusa itself, that inner source, and the positive pull of the Mutmena drive, the innate drive towards social and super-social connection.
So it has a spiritual and an innate social component.
Right. Contrast that with Freud's superego, which he saw as developing from internalizing parental rules, societal demands, and maybe some phylogenetic inheritance. Or even Adler's idea of sense of community, which is perhaps more of an external social motivator for behavior.
Different origins.
And a key difference the dissertation highlights. In Candrajiwa, when you reach liberation, individuality dissolves, and so does conscience as we know it. You're operating from the source. In Freud's view, the superego exists as long as the individual ego exists. The source of moral guidance fundamentally shifts or disappears in the liberated state described here.
What about concepts like anima and animus from Jung? Does the source address those?
It does, and it offers a much simpler explanation rooted in the Candrajiwa structure.
Simpler? How so?
What Jung described as animanimous phenomena, the contrasexual archetypes are seen in this framework as simply the result of shifting focus between the two main compensatory vital centers within the psychic realm: angen-angen, logic, intellect, and pangrasa, feelings, emotions.
So it's just about whether thinking or feeling is dominant?
Essentially, yes. The shift in focus or dominance between these two depends on the individual's inherent orientation, or perhaps their typical gender orientation according to societal norms. It grounds the experience in the interplay of these matter-bound centers, rather than seeing them as residues from a collective unconscious or phylogenetic inheritance like Jung did.
So, less mystical, more based on the described internal structure.
Exactly.
Despite all these pretty profound differences in the underlying model, did the author note any similarities in the approach to therapy?
Yes, there are some parallels mentioned. Things like recognizing the value of re-education, guiding the patient towards healthier functioning, and the importance of the therapist's own human qualities, empathy, understanding, that sort of thing.
Okay, common ground there.
But, and this is crucial, the ultimate goal of therapy derived from Candrajiwa is fundamentally distinct.
How so?
It's not just about symptom relief or social adjustment. The core aim is to stir the patient's own willingness to reorient themselves towards that universal, impersonal, immaterial center within them, towards Tripurusa.
Activating their inner potential.
Precisely. This inner potential is seen as the true source of healing power. So the therapy aims to ultimately reduce the patient's reliance, their transference, onto the therapist by directing them towards their own inner guide, Rahsa Jati.
Empowering the patient to find their own source of healing.
That's the ideal.
And maybe one last comparison, thinking about someone like Adler, with his focus on social adaptation, inferiority complex, overcoming challenges in the social sphere.
Right. Adler's focus on community feeling and social integration.
How does that compare to the Candrajiwa's goal?
Well, Candrajiwa certainly includes social responsibility, living Trisila, practicing Pancasila, doing Bodhidharma, compassion. These all involve others in society. But the ultimate drive isn't primarily social adaptation or even love for the community as an end in itself.
It's a means to an end.
It's oriented towards that transcendent goal, union with the absolute. The social aspects are vital for cultivating the qualities needed for that journey, but the journey itself is driven by an imminent spiritual pull from within towards Tripurusa. It involves ultimately a sacrifice or surrender of the individual ego for a universal truth. The source implies that Adler's system, focused on social mastery and belonging, lacks this specific transcendent dimension as the ultimate aim.
Okay, that distinction is clear. This has been, wow, a really deep exploration of such a complex and, frankly, quite different worldview. Let's try and maybe distill the core therapeutic insight we can take away from this Candrajiwa Indonesia concept based on the dissertation.
If I had to boil it down, I think the central, most impactful insight from this text is this. The potential for real healing, for transformation, isn't something outside of you that you need to find or something you build up from scratch.
Right.
It lies entirely in recognizing and then accepting the potential possibility within oneself. That's the phrase used. It's about uncovering that ever-present hidden core Tripurusa.
It's already there.
It's already there.
And all those practices we discussed, Trisila, Pancasila, Penemba, Tapabrata, Bodhidharma, Paliwara, they aren't just like abstract rules or rituals. They are the practical methods described for working with your own internal structure, right?
Precisely. They function as the tools. Tools for re-educating those vital centers, angen-angen, nafsu, rasa pangrasa. Tools for shifting your orientation inward, for overcoming the fixations or the inner disharmony, which the text implies are kind of like neuroses in Western terms.
Overcoming inner conflict.
Yes. And ultimately, tools for moving towards that state of liberation, pemudaran, by thinning out and eventually dissolving that veil of the ego.
So the role of therapy or guidance in this context becomes helping someone see that potential within and then choose to orient themselves towards it.
Exactly. Because the text argues that this potential, the Tripurusa, is universal. It resides outside the boundaries of our limited ego consciousness, but it's fundamentally inside every single person, waiting.
Yeah. This deep dive, it really reveals a path that challenges so many of our conventional ideas about what it means to be a healthy, fully developed human being.
It really does.
It suggests the highest potential isn't just, effective functioning in the world or managing psychological discomfort, but something much more radical. A transformation that involves the surrender of the individual ego to a universal transcendent consciousness that's accessible right here within us.
It certainly offers a powerful alternative perspective on human purpose and the nature of healing.
It makes you wonder, doesn't it? For you listening, what does this perspective challenge or maybe affirm in your own understanding of yourself, your purpose? The source describes this shift, the journey towards the immaterial center, as a continuous process, maybe a lifelong one. How might just recognizing the potential existence of that immaterial center within you change the way you navigate your own thoughts, your feelings, your desires, maybe starting right now? Something to think about.